Throughout this course, I've emphasized that humans operate at different levels of functioning, from the level of neurons to higher level thoughts and behaviors. In Module 3, we started at the most basic level, the biological level. Now, in Module 9, we fully turn our attention to higher levels of analysis, that is, at the level of people's observable behavior and the social contexts in which they find themselves. Specifically, in this module, we'll be looking at the subdiscipline of social psychology, which is actually my background area, so I'm excited to share it with you. Imagine for a second that you are in an argument with your roommate. What caused you two to fight? There could be many potential explanations. Perhaps your roommate forgot to do a chore she had promised to do. Perhaps you had a long, stressful day, and so you have a relatively short fuse. Or perhaps either you or your roommate are simply disagreeable kinds of people. Notice that these explanations place the cause of the argument in different locations. Some explanations, such as having a long day, locate the cause within the surrounding environmental context. This would be a situational explanation of someone's behavior, that is, the behavior is primarily the result of situational factors. In contrast, other explanations, such as you or your roommate simply being disagreeable, locate the cause of the behavior within the person, that is, their personality or their typical way of being. In the field of psychology, we have two different subdisciplines that each focus on these two dueling explanations for behavior. The subfield of personality psychology has traditionally looked for explanations of behavior within people's enduring traits and characteristics, and we'll be covering personality psychology next in Module 10. In contrast, the subfield of social psychology has traditionally looked for explanations of behavior in the surrounding situation. For example, one of the most famous studies in social psychology attempted to explain a phenomenon known as the bystander effect. These studies were inspired by a real-life event when a woman named Kitty Genovese was brutally murdered in Queens, New York in 1964. At the time, it was originally reported that potentially upwards of 30 of Kitty's neighbors in a nearby apartment complex had seen the attack and done nothing. Note that the attack happened in the very late hours of the night, around 2:30 a.m., and the murder occurred before the advent of the 911 emergency call system. In fact, it in part inspired its creation. Additionally, subsequent research has called into question much of the original reporting on this story. For example, most witnesses only heard Kitty scream, that is, they didn't actually see anything, and some witnesses later claimed that they did in fact call the police. Nevertheless, at the time, as the story was originally reported in the New York Times, the murder and the supposed apathy of Kitty's neighbors seemed rather shocking. Initially, many people's reactions were to say something like, "Can you believe how callous those New Yorkers are?" Notice that this is essentially a person-level explanation. However, a pair of social psychologists, John Darley and Bibb Latané, questioned this assumption. They thought that it was something about the situation, in particular the number of bystanders, that might have led to this tragic outcome. This suspicion led Darley and Latané to conduct their now famous series of studies examining how everyday people respond in emergency situations when they are either alone or in a crowd. In these studies, participants would come into the lab and then were led to believe that they were witnessing an emergency, such as seeing smoke from a potential fire or overhearing another participant supposedly have a seizure. In fact, the researchers had actually staged these emergencies, but the participants were initially led to believe that they were real. Over and over again, the researchers found that as the number of people witnessing an emergency increased, any single person was slower to respond, if they responded at all. Importantly, this shows the power of the situation. If anyone sees an emergency while in a crowd, they face situational forces, such as the fear of looking foolish in front of others, that will in turn impact their behavior. Although historically there used to be a lot of animosity between personality and social psychologists, today social and personality psychology are considered highly related sister fields. This is because researchers now recognize that both the person and the situation matter for predicting behavior. For example, later research on the bystander effect found that certain people, such as emergency responders who are trained to act in life-threatening situations, are less affected by the bystander effect. This is what is called a person-by-situation interaction. That is, aspects of both the person, such as somebody's knowledge, skills, background, or personality, and aspects in the immediate surrounding situation, are both important in predicting how somebody will ultimately respond. However, traditionally, social psychologists have primarily looked to situational explanations for people's behavior. The above studies on the bystander effect highlight another key hallmark of social psychological research, which is an attempt to study people's actual behavior, not just what they say they typically think or do. Often, in order to do so, researchers might create highly realistic simulations, such as the staged emergencies that participants in the bystander studies experienced. This is also illustrated by perhaps one of the most famous studies in all of psychology, Stanley Milgram's shock studies looking at obedience to authority. In these studies, Milgram had participants come into the lab where they believed they were doing a study on punishment and learning. As such, participants thought that they would be administering shocks to a supposed second participant while he learned a series of word pairs. In reality, this second participant was actually a Confederate who was working for the experimenter, and he did not receive any real shocks. As the experiment progressed, participants were led to believe that they were administering more and more intense shocks, potentially even causing serious physical harm to the Confederate. Yet, Milgram found that the majority of participants, around 65%, continued to administer what they believed to be potentially dangerous shocks simply because the experimenter ordered them to continue. Milgram's experiment is now considered unethical and would not be able to be conducted today. However, it does illustrate some of the key features of social psychological research. First, like Latney and Darley, Milgram's studies were inspired by a real-life event, namely the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals. Milgram was of Jewish heritage and wondered what would cause people to commit these heinous acts. And again, like Latney and Darley, rather than look to a person-level cause, Milgram thought that it was something about the situation that might be important. That is, placed in the right kind of situation, anyone might be coerced into potentially harming another person simply because they were ordered to do so. Second, to examine this idea, Milgram created a highly realistic simulation to examine people's actual behavioral responses. And the emotionally charged situation that he devised is probably in part why these studies became so famous. Another way that social psychologists might attempt to study people's actual behavior is to get out of the lab itself and instead look at people's natural responses in the wild, so to speak. These kinds of studies are called field studies. Let's look at a couple examples. Have you ever heard of the concept of 6 degrees of separation? That is, that we're all 5 or fewer contacts away from each other? You can see this idea illustrated here by the red line that connects Ryan with Pablo. Even though the two do not know each other directly and share different social networks, it's possible to connect Ryan with Pablo through just 5 contacts. This basic idea became the basis for a popular game called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where after being given a particular movie title, players have to connect actors in that movie to a movie starring Kevin Bacon using 5 or fewer moves. This pop cultural notion actually came directly from another study conducted by Stanley Milgram, although he doesn't often get credit for it. And thankfully, this study was much more ethical than his shock studies were. In his field study, Milgram sent packages to 160 random people in Omaha, Nebraska, and asked them to forward the package to a friend or acquaintance who they thought would bring the package closer to a final individual who was a stockbroker from Boston, Massachusetts. Overall, Milgram found that on average, it only took people about 5 intermediate acquaintances to get the package to its final stop, hence 6 degrees of separation. Another example of a field study was conducted by Robert Cialdini and colleagues looking at people's likelihood of reusing hotel towels. Cialdini worked with a real hotel and designed different signs asking guests to reuse their towels rather than having them washed after each use. Cialdini compared different types of messaging, for example, appealing to social norms versus environmental benefits, to see what would be most effective in actually getting guests to reuse their towels. By the way, messaging about social norms was by far the most effective. Although social psychologists are broadly interested in how situations, and in particular social situations, can influence our behavior, their specific research interests can be quite varied. For example, social psychologists might study seemingly opposite ends of a spectrum, such as aggressive behaviors on the one hand or helpful prosocial ones on the other. Social psychologists might also be interested in things like social influence, attitude formation and change, and stereotyping and prejudice. In the next video, I'll cover 3 related topics of attitudes, persuasion, and stereotyping. In the last video, I'll cover social influence, which includes topics like conformity, compliance, and obedience. In this video, I gave an overview of the field of social psychology. For the exam, you should be able to describe the difference between a person-level cause and a situational-level cause, and identify each in an example. Explain the difference between social psychology and personality psychology. Describe what is meant by a person-by-situation interaction. Describe the basic methods and results of the studies I described in this video, such as the bystander effect and Milgram's shock studies. Define field study, and describe what kinds of topics social psychologists are interested in studying.